The year was 1891, and the industrial town of Lancashire, England, was cloaked in coal smoke and soot. Life for the working class was difficult. The factories never slept, and neither did the poverty that stalked most families. Yet within a small, terraced house on a narrow cobblestone street, the Whittakers, John, a factory hand, and Mary, his wife, clung to a simple joy: their firstborn son, Thomas. Thomas was a fragile child from the beginning, born in the chill of winter with lungs that rattled when he cried. Still, to his parents, every breath he took was a miracle. Mary often sat by the small fireplace, rocking him to sleep, whispering lullabies to drown out the clatter of factory whistles. John, though weary from 12-hour shifts, would return home with small trinkets: a ribbon, a wooden toy, even a sugar sweet, just to coax a smile from his boy. In a world where death was always close, Thomas was their light. But in the spring of that year, when the first blooms began to poke through the soot-darkened earth, Thomas fell ill. What started as a fever soon turned to something far worse. A rash spreading across his tender skin, his breaths growing short and shallow. The village doctor, summoned at great expense, delivered the dreaded words scarlet fever. Mary's heart clenched at the name. She had heard whispers from other mothers, seen black ribbons hung on neighbors' doors. The disease had no mercy for children. She and John did everything they could. Cool cloths on his forehead, prayers whispered late into the night, watching over him in shifts so he was never alone. But as the days passed, the fever burned brighter and the baby's cries grew weaker. His once rosy cheeks turned pale. Mary begged God for a miracle, even offering her own life in exchange. John, silent but broken, kept pacing the floor, clenching his fists as though he could fight death itself if only given the chance. On a gray morning, with the sound of rain tapping against the window, Thomas's small body shuddered one last time. His tiny hand slipped from Mary's grasp, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sound they had ever known. Mary screamed, clutching him to her chest, rocking as though she could will his spirit back into his body. John fell to his knees, burying his face in his rough hands. For hours they sat in that room, unable to move, unable to accept that their light had gone out. In 1891, child death was tragically common. Entire families lost half their children before adulthood. Yet for every parent, the grief was not lessened by statistics. To Mary and John, Thomas was not a number. He was their son, their future, their joy. And now he was gone. Victorian society did not often allow open displays of grief, especially for working-class families. Death was to be endured silently, stoically. A father was expected to return to work after a few days, a mother to continue her household duties as though nothing had changed. Grief was private, hidden behind closed doors. But Mary could not contain her sorrow. She wrapped Thomas in a small blanket, unwilling to let him go. She whispered to him as though he still heard her promises of love, apologies for failing him, prayers for his peace. John tried to be strong, tried to comfort her, but his own heart felt as though it had been torn apart. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unsaid words and shared agony. Neighbors came to offer condolences, but their words felt hollow. "God's will," they said. "You'll have more children," as though Thomas could be replaced, as though a mother's love could be shifted from one child to another without breaking. In their grief, Mary remembered something she had seen once, a photograph of a neighbor's child, taken after death. The baby had been posed as though sleeping peacefully, a ribbon tied around her hair, her parents gazing down with sorrow but also with love. It had shocked Mary then, but now, she understood. She and John had never managed to afford a photograph of Thomas while he was alive. Photography was still an expensive luxury for families like theirs. But now, in death, there was one chance to capture his face, to preserve his memory forever. When Mary voiced the thought, John hesitated. "It feels wrong," he muttered, "like we'd be making a spectacle of him." But Mary shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, it will be all we have. When I am old, when memory fades, I will still have his face. I cannot let him vanish as though he never lived." Reluctantly, John agreed. A messenger was sent to summon a photographer. That night, before the photographer's arrival, Mary sat in the dim candlelight, holding Thomas in her lap. She studied every detail: His tiny nose, the curve of his lips, the way his hair curled softly at the crown. She was terrified of forgetting. John sat beside her, his rough hand resting gently on the baby's blanket. For the first time since the death, he spoke more than a few words. "He had my eyes," he whispered. "Did you notice?" Mary nodded, sobbing. Together, they spoke of Thomas. His first smile, the way he clutched John's finger, the soft cooing sounds he made when Mary sang. Every memory was a wound, but also a comfort. As dawn broke, they steeled themselves for what was to come. The photograph would not bring Thomas back, but it would give them something to hold on to, a fragment of their love captured in time. The Whittaker's story was not unique. Across England, countless families endured the same sorrow, the same silent grief. But each child lost was a universe to their parents, a light extinguished. The world expected them to bear it quietly, but inside the pain was immeasurable. For the Whittakers, the decision to photograph their son was not about defying society. It was about survival. It was about clinging to the only proof that Thomas had lived, that he had mattered. Their grief was heavy, but their love was heavier still. The Whittakers did not sleep the night before the photographer's arrival. Grief weighed too heavily on their hearts, and fear gnawed at them, fear that they were doing something improper, something society would scorn. Yet stronger than the fear was a single desire to remember. In 1891, photography was still both wondrous and unsettling. It was said that to capture an image was to hold a piece of life itself. For the wealthy, portraits had long been a way to immortalize loved ones. But for working-class families like John and Mary Whittaker, one photograph could cost weeks of wages. That was why, in life, they had never managed to afford one of little Thomas. Now in death, they resolved that his image would not vanish with him. At first light, a knock echoed through the house. John opened the door to find Mr. Hollis, the traveling photographer, standing solemnly with his wooden box camera strapped to his back. His face was weathered from years of work, his eyes steady but not unkind. He had done this before, too many times. "I am sorry for your loss," Hollis said softly, doffing his hat. "Shall we proceed?" Mary, pale and hollow-eyed, simply nodded. She clutched Thomas to her chest as though someone might steal him away. Hollis entered the small parlor, scanning the room for light. He pulled the curtains wide to let in the gray morning sun. From his case, he drew out tripods, lenses, and plates, laying them out with the precision of a surgeon. The air felt thick, heavy with both sorrow and reverence. Mary hesitated as Hollis explained the process. "The child must be positioned, ma'am," he said gently. "Would you prefer him in your arms or seated alone?" Her arms tightened instinctively. "Alone," she whispered after a long pause. "Let him look as though he is only sleeping." Together, Hollis and John set up a small chair, draping it with a clean white sheet. Mary dressed Thomas in his christening gown, the same one he had worn the day he was welcomed into the church. She smoothed his curls, kissed his forehead, and placed him gently in the chair. The sight broke her heart. He looked peaceful, almost alive, but the stillness was too complete. His little hands, folded in his lap, would never grasp again. Tears blurred her eyes, and she turned away. Hollis worked with practiced care, adjusting the child's head so it tilted slightly. As though resting, he propped the tiny body with supports hidden beneath the gown, making sure the pose would hold long enough for the long exposure. These were the secrets of post-mortem photography, techniques meant to give families the illusion of life, even in death. When everything was ready, Hollis placed the camera before the child and drew the cloth over his head. He adjusted the lens, the room silent except for the ticking of his pocket watch. Finally, he emerged, setting the exposure plate with deliberate precision. "Now we must hold very still," he said. Mary sat rigid, her hands gripping her skirt. John stood beside her, jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the baby. Though they were not in the frame, they held their breath as though any movement might disturb their son's rest. For long seconds the shutter remained open, drinking in the pale light, fixing forever the image of a life already ended. When Hollis finally closed it, the sound seemed to echo like a final breath. "It is done," he murmured. Mary surprised even herself when she asked for one more photograph, with Thomas in her arms. She had feared she would collapse beneath the weight of it, but something inside her told her this might be her only chance to appear with her son. Hollis nodded, and she gathered the baby close once more. Sitting in the chair, she cradled him against her chest. John stood behind, resting a trembling hand on her shoulder. The camera captured not just their faces, but their grief. Mary's eyes swollen from tears, John's features hardened by sorrow. When the shutter clicked, the Whittakers froze in time, a family bound together by love and loss. Developing photographs was no instant matter. Hollis carefully packed his plates and promised to return within days with the finished image. "I will handle them with great care," he assured the couple. "You shall have him forever." When he left, the silence returned heavier than before. Mary sank into the chair, still holding Thomas. "Do you think it was right?" she asked, her voice fragile. John crouched before her, looking into her eyes. "It was love," he said simply, "and love cannot be wrong." True to his word, Hollis returned days later with the finished photograph. The Whittakers lit a lamp as he unwrapped the plate and revealed the image beneath. There was Thomas, dressed in white, eyes closed as though peacefully napping. The detail was startling: every curl of his hair, every crease in his tiny hands, preserved with eerie precision. Mary gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. She reached out as though she could touch him. Tears fell freely, but for the first time since his death, she smiled through them. "He looks alive," she whispered. John placed an arm around her shoulders. He too was shaken, but he saw the comfort it gave her. The photograph was not life, but it was memory, and memory, he realized, was sometimes all that kept grief from consuming the living. What the Whittakers could not know was that their private act of remembrance would soon travel far beyond their home. Hollis, proud of his work, included the image in a local exhibition on the art of memory. To him, it was a beautiful example of love expressed through the lens. But to others, it would become something far more divisive, a photograph that stirred outrage, sparked debate, and ultimately shocked history. For now, though, in that small home in Lancashire, the Whittakers did not care what others might think. They had their son's face preserved for eternity. In their grief-stricken world, that was enough. When Mr. Hollis, the photographer, first displayed the Whittakers' portrait in his small studio exhibition, he did not imagine the storm it would unleash. His exhibit, titled "The Art of Memory," was meant to showcase the growing practice of mourning photography. Images of the departed preserved in eternal stillness. In Victorian England, where child mortality was a grim reality, such photographs were not rare, though they remained controversial. Hollis believed the Whittakers' portrait to be one of his finest works. The baby Thomas, dressed in white, appeared almost asleep. The light streaming across his face gave a softness, a sense of innocence untouched by suffering. To Hollis it was beautiful, an image of peace carved from grief. He had asked the Whittakers for permission to include it, and though hesitant, John had agreed, seeing it as a way to honor their son's brief existence. But once the image was displayed publicly, it left the realm of private mourning and entered the court of public opinion. Visitors to the exhibition stopped before the photograph with gasps, some covering their mouths in shock. A few mothers broke into tears, struck by the haunting reality of what they were seeing. Others turned away, unable to look for more than a moment. Yet not everyone was moved to sympathy. A gentleman in a fine coat was overheard sneering, "Morbid indulgence. It is one thing to mourn a child, another to parade his corpse before strangers." His words carried weight, for many in Victorian society viewed public grief, especially from the lower classes, as vulgar. Within days, word spread beyond the studio walls. Local newspapers, always eager for a sensation, picked up the story. Headlines branded the image with phrases like "ghastly spectacle" and "morbid curiosity on display." The controversy lit a fire in the press. Some columnists condemned the practice outright. "What refinement can be found?" wrote one critic in the Lancashire Gazette, on immortalizing death's pale mask. "Such displays offend the dignity of the deceased and the decency of the living." Others defended the Whittakers, pointing out the cruel hypocrisy of the upper classes. "Do we not hang portraits of kings long dead in our halls?" countered another. Do not the wealthy pay painters to immortalize their children posthumously, posing them as if alive? Yet when a poor family seeks to preserve their child through the cheaper art of photography, they are condemned. The fault is not in the act, but in society's prejudice. The debate spilled from newspapers into public gatherings, drawing lines between tradition and progress, propriety and empathy. For John and Mary, the storm was a second tragedy. They had wanted nothing more than to keep the memory of their son alive. Now their grief was being dissected by strangers. Neighbors whispered when Mary passed in the market, some offering pity, others condemnation. "She's mad," muttered one woman, cradling that photograph as though it were the child himself. John grew defensive, his quiet dignity hardened into anger. "It was our son," he told anyone who dared question them, "and no one will tell me how to grieve him." Yet privately, the burden weighed heavily. Mary avoided church for weeks, unable to bear the stares. John, though furious at the critics, wondered if he had failed in his duty as a husband by allowing the photograph to leave their home. Their private sorrow had become a spectacle, and it felt like another loss. Fueling the flames, local clergymen began to speak against the practice from their pulpits. One sermon declared, "The Lord commands us to bury our dead in reverence, not display them as though they were dolls for amusement. To fix death upon a plate of glass is to trap the soul in the world it has left. It is blasphemy clothed in art." These words struck many with fear. Superstitions about the soul and the afterlife were still strong. Some whispered that families who photographed their dead might be cursed, their houses haunted by spirits unable to rest. For the wheat-takers, who clung to faith for comfort, the clergy's condemnation was perhaps the hardest blow of all. Mary wept, convinced that she had sinned against her child by agreeing to the photograph. But not all voices condemned them. Some reformers, particularly women writers and activists, began to speak out in defense of mourning photography. One article in a women's periodical argued, "Why should grief be hidden? Is a mother not allowed to remember the face of the child she bore? If society denies her that comfort, it denies her humanity. These photographs are not grotesque. They are acts of love." Letters to the editor poured in from mothers who had lost children. Many confessed that they, too, had post-mortem photographs kept privately in drawers or beneath pillows. The Whittaker's case had given them a voice they had been too ashamed to use. The more controversy raged, the more people sought to see the photograph for themselves. Crowds gathered at Hollis's studio, some out of sympathy, others out of morbid curiosity. The image of little Thomas became infamous, spoken of in taverns, debated in parlors, even mentioned in Parliament during discussions on public morality. In a way, the outrage ensured that the photograph achieved what the Whittakers had intended. Their son would not be forgotten. He had lived only a few months, yet in death, his face became known far beyond the small Lancashire street where he was born. For John and Mary, the public uproar was both blessing and curse. Their son's memory had been preserved, but at a cost they had not foreseen. They bore the weight of being symbols in a debate they had never asked to join. Yet in quiet moments, when the world's judgment faded away, Mary would hold the photograph close and whisper to it as though to Thomas himself. "They may scorn us," she would say, "but you are mine, and you will never be erased." The Whittaker's ordeal forced Victorian society to confront an uncomfortable truth: death was everywhere, yet people preferred silence over acknowledgement. The photograph ripped away that veil, exposing grief that could not be hidden. It scandalized, but it also humanized, and though many condemned the practice, others began to see it not as vulgarity but as necessity. The photograph of Thomas Whittaker had opened a wound in society, but also, perhaps, a path toward healing. The photograph of little Thomas Whittaker had spread far beyond the boundaries of Lancashire by the summer of 1891. What began as one grieving family's private act of remembrance had become a subject of fierce national debate. Some condemned it as grotesque, others defended it as sacred, but nearly everyone seemed to have an opinion. And in that uproar, the photograph became something more than just an image of a lost child. It became a mirror, reflecting the very soul of Victorian society, its fears, its contradictions, and its unspoken truths. For the working poor, death was no stranger. It lingered in factories, where unsafe machines mangled men, in soot-choked streets, where disease thrived, and in the cradles of countless families, where infants rarely survived their first years. Yet grief among the poor was expected to remain quiet, almost invisible. The wealthy, on the other hand, had long enshrined their dead in oil and canvas. Stately homes displayed portraits of pale children in white gowns, painted long after their passing, adorned with flowers symbolizing innocence and purity. These were accepted, even celebrated, as art. But when the Whittakers, a working-class couple, used the new medium of photography to achieve the same remembrance, they were scorned. Critics called it indecent, even vulgar. Why was grief noble in silk and oils but shameful on glass and paper? The answer was not in morality but in class prejudice. The photograph forced society to confront its double standard. The Whittakers had merely claimed, through affordable photography, what the wealthy had long enjoyed, the right to remember. The Victorian age was paradoxical in its relationship with death. Cemeteries were adorned with angels and towering monuments, funeral processions wound through streets with elaborate ritual, and mourning dress was an industry unto itself. Death was everywhere, yet it was also taboo. People wanted death acknowledged, but only in controlled forms: black veils, quiet services, poetic epitaphs. Anything too raw, too real was seen as indecorous. The Whittakers' photograph stripped away the symbolism and ritual, revealing death as it was: a tiny, pale child who had stopped breathing. It unsettled people not because it was grotesque, but because it was honest. The photograph reminded them that beneath the rituals and monuments, death was stark and unavoidable. It pierced the illusion that grief could be neatly dressed in lace and buried beneath ceremony. The photograph also reflected society's expectations of women. Victorian mothers were praised for their virtue in bearing children, but they were rarely allowed to speak openly of the agony of losing them. They were expected to endure, to bow to God's will, and to keep their suffering dignified and private. Mary Whittaker broke that silence, not with words but with an image. By choosing to preserve Thomas's likeness, she claimed her right to grieve openly. To many women who saw the photograph, her act was quietly revolutionary. It told them their grief was valid, that their pain deserved recognition. In parlors and kitchens across the country, mothers whispered to one another, "I too lost a child. I too would want to remember." The photograph had given voice to countless women who had been told to suffer silently. The scandal also revealed the unease of a society caught between tradition and modernity. Photography was still a relatively young art, and many mistrusted it. Unlike a painting, which could idealize, a photograph revealed. It captured truth without polish, exposing blemishes, imperfections, and in this case, the cold reality of death. Some argued that using such a modern invention to depict something as sacred as death was unnatural, even dangerous. Rumors spread that cameras could trap the souls of the dead, preventing them from reaching heaven. Others countered that photography was simply a tool, no different than paintbrushes, only more honest. The Whittakers' photograph stood at the heart of this clash. To some, it was proof of photography's vulgarity. To others, it was evidence of its profound power to tell truths that society preferred to hide. What made the debate so intense was not just the image itself, but what it revealed about society's selective compassion. When wealthy families lost children, society mourned with them, their grief clothed in poetry and marble monuments. When poor families grieved, they were told to endure silently, to keep working, to accept that children die. The Whittakers' photograph forced people to look into the eyes of a working-class family's grief. It was uncomfortable, because it demanded equality in mourning. It said our child's life mattered too. That was the true scandal. Not the image of death, but the image of love across class lines. As the months passed, more families came forward with their own post-mortem photographs, long hidden in drawers and boxes. What had once been whispered about was now spoken of openly. The controversy around the Whittakers' photo cracked the wall of silence. Clergy continued to condemn the practice, yet others in society began to defend it. Some physicians even argued that photographs helped families confront grief more directly, aiding in acceptance rather than denial. Women writers praised the courage of mothers who preserved such images. Slowly, what had been scandal began to take root as a form of remembrance, not universally accepted, but no longer universally despised. Thomas Whitaker had lived less than a year, yet through the photograph, he became a symbol of something far greater, the right of ordinary people to grieve, to remember, and to be acknowledged. The outrage his image sparked said more about the fears and hypocrisies of society than about the photograph itself. In truth, the child had done nothing but exist and die. It was society that revealed itself in the uproar, its discomfort with honesty, its disdain for the poor, its need to control grief. The Whitakers had not intended to challenge society, they had only wanted to hold on to their child. Yet in doing so, they forced the world to look at itself, and it did not always like what it saw. In the end, the photograph was less a scandal than a revelation. It revealed that grief is universal, that love is not confined to class, and that remembrance is a human need, not a privilege. It showed that behind society's polished surface lay fear, prejudice, and silence. And in holding up that mirror, the Whitakers, ordinary, grieving parents, became unwitting agents of change. When the photograph of Thomas Whitaker first appeared in Mr. Hollis's studio, it was met with horror, disgust, and accusations of indecency. But time has a way of reshaping perception. What had been scandalous in 1891 began slowly and quietly to evolve into something else, a symbol, not just of one child's brief life, but of the power of memory, love, and resilience in the face of loss. Public controversies, no matter how fierce, eventually tire themselves out. By the winter of 1891, newspapers were writing less about the ghastly photograph and more about politics, labor strikes, and the affairs of the royal family. The Whitakers, though still whispered about in their Lancashire town, began to slip from the headlines. Yet the photograph did not disappear. Hollis, despite the initial backlash, refused to destroy the plate. He insisted it was one of his finest works and kept a print in his private collection. For John and Mary Whitaker, the photograph remained their most cherished possession, a daily reminder that their son had once lived. For them, the storm of criticism had not erased the image's meaning. If anything, it deepened it. The photograph had endured the world's judgment, just as they had endured their grief. Even during the height of the scandal, defenders of the Whitakers' choice had emerged. Mothers wrote letters to newspapers confessing that they too kept post-mortem photographs hidden in their homes. One woman revealed she had 3, each of a child lost before the age of 2. Another admitted she wore a locket containing a tiny photo of her stillborn daughter, pressed against her heart every day. These testimonies began to shift the conversation. What had been portrayed as morbid indulgence was increasingly understood as a widespread, if private, practice. The Whitakers had not been an aberration. They had merely brought into the open what many others had been too fearful to admit. Slowly, sympathy replaced scorn. People began to see not vulgarity in the photograph, but courage. What truly transformed the photograph into a symbol was its defiance of class boundaries. In wealthy households, paintings of dead children adorned parlors without condemnation. But a working-class family had dared to claim the same right through photography, and society had recoiled. Yet in recoiling, society exposed its hypocrisy. The photograph forced the recognition that grief did not respect class. The poor loved their children as fiercely as the rich. Their memories, their losses, were no less sacred. Over time, the photograph of Thomas Whitaker came to represent something larger than itself, the demand for dignity in mourning, regardless of wealth or station. By the early 1890s, debates around death, mourning, and dignity were growing louder. Reformers argued for better working conditions to reduce infant mortality, for improved sanitation in industrial towns, and for recognition of the emotional toll carried by working-class families. In these discussions, the Whitaker case was sometimes invoked, not by name but as an example. Shall we mock a mother for wishing to remember her child? One reformer asked in Parliament, or shall we ask why so many children are dying in the first place? In this way, the scandalous photograph became indirectly linked to social progress. It did not cause reform, but it became a touchstone, a reminder of the humanity at stake. Within their modest home, The Whitakers framed the photograph and placed it on the mantel. Visitors sometimes looked away uncomfortable, but John and Mary refused to hide it. For them, it was not a grotesque display, but a declaration: he was ours, and he mattered. The image became a silent teacher for their surviving children. Whenever they asked about the baby in the photograph, John and Mary would tell them about Thomas, his short life, his gentle eyes, his laughter before the illness. The photograph kept his memory alive in a way words alone never could. In this way, what had been condemned by society became a source of strength within the family. It was not just a picture of death, it was proof of love. As the years passed, post-mortem photography became more widely recognized, if not always openly discussed. Studios across Britain continued to offer the service discreetly. Photographers learned to pose the dead as though asleep, to soften the harshness of loss with artful lighting. By the turn of the century, mourning photography was no longer seen only as morbid curiosity. It was increasingly acknowledged as a legitimate expression of remembrance, particularly among the working and middle classes. And at the heart of this cultural shift lay stories like that of the Whitakers, families who had endured ridicule, but held firm to the belief that their grief was worthy of being remembered. Perhaps the greatest transformation of the photograph was in what it came to symbolize beyond the Whitakers' personal grief. It was no longer just the image of a dead child, it was the image of resilience, of love defying silence, of ordinary people demanding dignity. It became a symbol of the universality of loss, reminding all who saw it that death is the one fate shared by rich and poor alike, and in that reminder lay a kind of equality, a truth society could not ignore. The scandal had begun with accusations of indecency, with whispers that the Whitakers were mad or unholy, but in time the photograph transcended scandal. It endured, it survived judgment, and in doing so, it became something greater, a symbol of love unashamed, of memory preserved, of grief given voice. The photograph of Thomas Whitaker did not erase the pain of his loss. It could not bring him back, but it transformed his brief life into something that touched thousands, perhaps even millions, long after he was gone. From scandal to symbol, the photograph's journey mirrored the journey of grief itself, painful, misunderstood, resisted, but ultimately a testament to the strength of love. The year 1891 faded into memory. Newspapers moved on to other scandals, other tragedies, other stories that captured the public's restless appetite. Yet within the quiet home of John and Mary Whitaker, the small framed photograph of their son Thomas remained in its place of honor on the mantelpiece. It had caused outrage, condemnation, and debate, but for the Whitakers, it had always been something simpler, a memory of love. And as the years turned into decades, the meaning of that photograph began to grow. Its lesson endured not just for the family, but for all who came to understand its significance. For John and Mary, the first lesson was personal and immediate, that love does not end with death. The photograph reminded them daily that their son's short life had mattered. When Mary felt sorrow pressing too heavily upon her, she would hold the image and whisper, "You were here, Thomas. You belong to us." In a time when grief was often hidden, when mothers were told to move on, and fathers to bury their pain in work, the Whitakers clung to their memory without shame. Their refusal to forget taught their surviving children that grief was not weakness, but a testament to love. The lesson endured within the family for generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren would later recall the story of the little photograph on the mantel, and how it had taught them to honor the past, no matter how painful. Beyond personal grief, the Whitakers' story revealed a second lesson, the courage to stand against society's judgment. At the height of the scandal, when neighbors gossiped and clergy condemned, it would have been easy for the Whitakers to hide the photograph away, to yield to shame. Yet they refused. Their defiance was quiet, but it was profound. By keeping the photograph in plain sight, they sent a message: our grief is ours to carry, and no one may dictate how we remember our child. This act of courage became the heart of the photograph's legacy. It showed that dignity is not granted by society. It is claimed by those who choose to stand firm, even when the world disapproves. The scandal also left a deeper social lesson: grief belongs to everyone, not only to the privileged. The Whitakers, a working-class family, had been mocked for doing openly what wealthy families had long done quietly through paintings and sculptures. Their story exposed the hypocrisy of a society that accepted mourning in marble but scorned it on paper. In this way, the photograph became more than a family relic. It became a symbol of equality in mourning, a reminder that every life, no matter how short or humble, deserves remembrance. This truth resonated long after the scandal faded. It whispered to other families who had felt their grief dismissed because of poverty, gender, or class. It told them your loss is no less real. Your memory is no less sacred. The photograph also offered an uncomfortable but necessary lesson about truth. Victorian society had loved to clothe death in symbols and rituals, dressing grief in veils and euphemisms. But the camera stripped away those layers. It showed death as it was, unpolished, unidealized, undeniable. For many, this honesty was frightening. Yet for others, it was liberating. The Whitakers' photograph taught that truth, however painful, can be a form of healing. By looking at their son as he was, they were able to keep him real in memory, not a fading dream, but a child who had truly lived. This lesson has endured into modern times, reminding us that hiding from reality does not soften grief. It only delays it. Healing begins when we face the truth with courage. As decades passed and the practice of post-mortem photography gave way to new customs, the lesson of the Whitakers' story continued to echo. Historians studying the period would later note how such photographs revealed the human struggle to hold on to love in the face of loss. For modern readers, the lesson is clear. Memory is not something to be ashamed of. Love is not diminished by death, it is transformed. Just as the Whitakers preserved their son's likeness in an age when such acts were ridiculed, families today keep mementos, letters, and images of their loved ones, sometimes facing the same question, why hold on? Why not move on? The Whitakers' answer endures across time, because love deserves to be remembered. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that grief unites us. In 1891, the photograph divided society between those who condemned and those who sympathized. Yet over time, the divisions faded, and what remained was the recognition of something universal. Every person, whether rich or poor, powerful or forgotten, will face loss. In that sense, the Whitakers' photograph was never just about one family. It was about all families. It spoke to the fragility of life and the permanence of love. It reminded humanity that beneath differences of class, religion, or culture, we are bound together by the same truths. We love, we lose, and we long to remember. By the time John and Mary passed away in the early years of the new century, their story had quieted into history. Yet the photograph of Thomas survived, faded at the edges, fragile but still intact. It became not only a relic of one family's sorrow but a witness to a larger truth, that courage in grief can outlast scandal, that love can outshine condemnation, and that memory can endure when all else is gone. The lesson that endured was not simply about death. It was about life, about the importance of cherishing it, about the courage to remember, and about the dignity that belongs to every soul, no matter how brief its time on earth. In that single image of a sleeping child, condemned by some and cherished by others, an eternal truth was captured: love does not die.